So in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Really appreciate everybody coming. And there are certainly more seats available here in the front or hang out in the back. Am I getting echo? Should I move this? Is that better? We're good? Okay. So we put together this panel today. I wanted to bring in some sort of a group of experts to look at sort of a broader spectrum of energy and some of the impact of nuclear energy in Texas. So today we have Greg Schultze from ExxonMobil, Dr. Elizabeth Sooby from UT San Antonio, and Eric Wieser, who is a researcher here at UT Austin. Would you guys mind taking just a couple minutes and sort of introduce yourself and the kinds of things that you're interested in and focused on?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So Greg Schultze, I'm with ExxonMobil. Pleasure to be here. And one of the things I think wanted to share with the group this morning is we require a lot of power and heat in our operations. It's kind of silly to say, but it takes a lot of energy to produce energy. And so nuclear is one way of creating that energy and heat. And so we're here seeking to understand how that could fit into the equation, how that could fit into the solution. I think there's a lot of challenges on that journey, but it's going to be an important part of the mix. So did I lose you? Can y'all hear me? Test. Hello?
Yes. Switch real quick.
Is that working? Okay, it's back on. Okay, so I sit within. So I sit within our global projects organization. I've been with the company for 11 years, and I'm leading our efforts to understand how nuclear could integrate into our operations and assets. So, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Elizabeth Sooby. I'm an associate professor in the Physics and Astronomy department with a joint appointment in Mechanical Engineering at UT San Antonio. I've been at UTSA for almost 8 years. Prior to that, I was at Los Alamos National Lab as a scientist too in the Fuels Research Laboratory, which is kind of nestled within a material science and technology division. My degrees are all in physics, but and my training is mostly all in nuclear material science. So when we say nuclear material science, that has a lot to do with fuels, the fuel compounds, how do we make them. Making them on a research and development scale is very different than if the Westinghouses of the world were going to go industrialize that process. And we specifically focus on advanced reactor fuels. So these are what we call high uranium density. So they have a higher atom density of uranium than uranium dioxide. So these are uranium nitride, carbides, borides. I also did my PhD all in molten salt work, so molten salt chemistry, particularly uranium chloride chemistry. And we also look at the cladding structures and materials that contain these fuels in advanced reactors. So we've worked on triso fuels, advanced cladding materials, iron, chrome, aluminum alloys. And so a lot of our work is in synthesis because we can't just go buy these things off the shelf when we're talking about advanced reactor fuels. But the other side of our work is in accident testing. So for any given advanced reactor, there are certain accident scenarios that involve environmental exposure, whether that's steam or hydrogen, depending on the reactor type or reactor application. We look at all of those things as well and then use some advanced characterization techniques to understand how things break and when they break to better inform the industry on what that operational envelope can be for your nuclear fuel form.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Wieser. I'm a researcher here at the University of Texas. My focus is on the economics and financial analysis of building new nuclear plants across the state of Texas and the greater United States as a whole. I got my degree my undergrad degree from Berkeley in energy economics and my master's from here at UT in energy economics as well. I'm working towards a PhD in nuclear engineering. It's a bit of a switch up. But lately my main focus has been analyzing new advanced reactor types like molten salt reactors and potential energy storage solutions that are on site, whether it be battery or in the form of stored molten salt as a battery or compressed air below ground. A lot of really exciting work, and it's interesting to see how some of these technologies, as they change, the economics seem to switch up a lot, and then in conjunction with how new state policies can make these projects seem to speed up quite a bit.
Thanks. So at that high level, we have an element of deep ingrained nuclear fuels and materials, applications of high temperature heat for industrial purposes, and sort of a broad perspective on the economics of these different systems. So looking sort of in some ways at some of the interfaces of those. On the application of nuclear heat, what do you really see as the end user challenges or the challenges from an end user perspective, and what are some of the things that are happening in nuclear materials that can help with that?
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted the heat aspect of it, because I think that's where the challenges really present themselves for integration into industrial facilities. So when folks think of nuclear, generally you think of electricity generation. That's primarily what's done today with the fleet, and then around the world there's a handful of applications where there's nuclear integration for process heat into an industrial facility, but it's not really done at scale. If it's a power integration, that's well understood. That's relatively straightforward. 60 hertz, 50 hertz, you set your voltage. But if you're talking about sending heat to an industrial application, now you have a two-way communication, right? You're sending steam, or it could be some other process fluid, and then you got to send that fluid back. So a boiler feed water if you're running a Rankine cycle. And then there's all sorts of complications that come with that, and sending it back and forth, and load following, and that deep integration is a challenge. Regulatory as well. Today, the regulatory environment really extends into that secondary system, into the steam system. And if you think about an industrial application, you really don't want to have regulatory jurisdiction all through your piping throughout your whole facility, right? So there's a number of challenges. I don't see them as being insurmountable, but I think it's really important that the industrial end users have a voice. They come forward and they articulate what these use cases are, what the requirements and needs are, and then work together with the industry to solve those. We can't expect that a heat integrated solution is just going to materialize on its own. It's going to require a lot of problem solving, a lot of engineering, a lot of collaboration to make it happen. So that's kind of the first thing I want to share with the folks, is that we need to have this conversation. We need to come to the table. And that's one of the things that trying to do today, and one of my messages internally, as well as how we need to work to collaborate. So it's solving the technical part of actually bolting it up, connecting it together, sending process fluid back and forth, the regulatory challenges, the business model, the operating model, right? Who's going to own it? Who's going to operate it? And you get into the commercial applications as well. This has not been done before, and all of those are going to be really tough challenges.
Yeah, so I'm focused, mostly on things that are inside the core. But that said, I think from the nuclear industry and nuclear materials community, one really exciting thing is seeing this transition where industry is excited about nuclear reactors powering, whether it's a data center or industrial processes. So I know there was a partnership between Dow and X-Energy, I believe, to use process steam for some of their chemical processing, as well as actually having the reactor power some of their facility. From the design of the reactor, which I'm not a nuclear engineer, I'm an imposter in that field. I'm a physicist and material scientist. But from the reactor design, when we start scaling down, so when you start looking at micro reactors or even small modular reactors, the neutronics of all of that core, how the neutrons move around and drive fission, it changes fundamentally. So one of the things we look at from the fuel side and from the material side is how do we enhance the efficiency of that reactor? And for those students in the room that have taken thermodynamics, the biggest thing we need from efficiency is going to be this delta T. We want to have our coolant, the difference between the outlet and the inlet of that coolant be as broad of a temperature range as possible. So that means allowing our fuel to operate at higher temperatures. So that's when you get into concepts like advanced gas reactors, where you can have helium at much higher temperatures than what we have with water-cooled reactors. So that's one thing, is pushing these materials just to higher temperatures. So we have, going to conferences on these topics, you have everything from code qualification of structural materials, because now we're pushing things beyond the original operating temperatures that they were designed for, all the way to how can we make sure that our fuel can handle these temperatures. So without getting too far into the weeds, the fuels we've been using for the last 60, 70 years are oxides, they're ceramics. I tell my students these are like, grandma's china plates. They can go in the oven, they can take extreme temperatures, but they don't necessarily dissipate that heat very well, so it takes a long time for that to cool before you can touch it. When we start looking at intermetallic compounds, or what we call functional ceramics, they get rid of that heat much more efficiently, which means you can run them at a higher temperature, because you're not going to have a huge what we call gradient. So the center of your fuel is not going to be hundreds of degrees Celsius higher than the outside. So those are the things we look at. So how can we push to higher temperatures to get better efficiency? And how can we pack as much uranium into a fuel form so that these cartridge cores, which we would kind of transition to for microreactors, you can run those for longer and have a longer fuel cycle. So trying to bridge the two very different sides of this. But there's a lot of fundamental R&D, both on just materials as well as fuels, that you can do to try to enable technologies that would be more applicable to these types of industrial applications.
Interesting. Thanks. So how about the economics? So when you can envision there are lots of different things that you could use the heat at different temperatures, different purposes, and then fundamentally in all of your systems you also need electricity. I imagine that there's a lot of capital expenditure to try to decide, am I going to make an electricity plant and a really high temperature heat plant and a low temperature steam plant? How does the economics come into play if you're trying to support a whole variety of end uses, as opposed to let me pick one and just crush it? Or is there value in having diverse income streams?
Sure, I can start on that. I think, as with a lot of things, it's going to come down to cost. Say if you had a plant where they wanted the heat just to separate or combine chemicals, like I think the one that's being built in South Texas, at the Seadrift plant, they may decide that it's cheaper to only use that reactor for heat because they don't want to build the additional turbines and deal with, as you had mentioned, the regulatory issues that come with building up the electrical system. They may not want to build the transmission lines and connect it outward toward the grid. So they may just build it and only use it for those industrial purposes, and then draw the electricity that they actually need to run the plant from the grid, because maybe they don't want to spend an extra $80 million a year on the operations and maintenance for the turbines and everything else that goes into that. If you're not using it for chemical separation or a plant like that, then maybe you do want to have both. I think it really depends on what your needs are and what kind of costs you're looking at.
So when we build a big project, say a big chemical manufacturing facility, through the planning process, we'll go through and clearly define what are the outputs and what are the inputs needed of that facility. And so we'll come up with a determination of what we call our offsites and utilities. So how much power do we need? How much steam? How much heat do we need? Water, hydrogen, other kind of inputs as well. But thinking from a nuclear standpoint, how much power, how much electricity, and how much heat, and then we'll go through and very robust process to determine what is the best way to provide that. Is it a form of self-generation? Is it procuring it from someone else? If it's power only, is it just getting it from the grid? And so depending on the location, market outlook, we go through and kind of weigh all the options and try to determine what is the most economic way of providing that for our facility. There's trade-offs between doing it yourself versus relying on a third party. If you do it yourself, it's typically a large capital investment. And so that's with nuclear, one of the challenges is the large capital outlay to build the facility. So typically today, if we need both power and heat, we'll do what's called a cogeneration facility. So natural gas turbine generating electricity. The exhaust flue gases coming out of that turbine are hot enough that you can actually extract that heat and generate steam coming off that off the exhaust gas. And then you take that steam and you use it in your facility. So you're trading a low capital with that natural gas turbine solution. You're trading a low capital but higher operating costs, higher OPEX, and variable OPEX. You're trading that for a nuclear solution in this case, which is higher capital but lower operating costs and very stable. You can get a pretty good outlook on what that is. When you crunch the numbers, depending on the economics, they may give you kind of the same result at the end, right? But it's important to remember, though, that you are outlaying a lot of cash up front for building the nuclear facility versus a natural gas turbine facility, right? So there's other things that will come into consideration besides just the straight numbers. But if nuclear, if the cost can come down for that capital outlay, especially for that kind of commercial at scale nth of a kind deployments, I think that's where it could have the potential to compete there. Because if you can get comfortable with that investment and then you have a really stable, relatively low cost operating cost moving forward, that's a pretty attractive solution versus natural gas, which can be pretty variable. Now in Texas, we're blessed with cheap, abundant natural gas, but that's not true around the world, right? So there's scenarios where in Texas you're $3-4 natural gas. It could be 2-3 times higher around the world, right? So that's where nuclear kind of from our view looks like it could maybe be something to consider and to look at for powering our facilities.
Thanks. So after Fukushima, there was a really big investment and interest in what the federal government called accident-tolerant fuels and claddings. I know, Dr. Sooby, you were heavily involved in a lot of those things. How much does economics of those advanced fuels and claddings come into play in the decision in what to research? Or was the federal government sort of instigating hey, let's come up with something better and decide later if it makes financial sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at the early days of accident-tolerant fuels, or I guess I will say my early involvement, I think they were kind of in the phase 2 part of that, where industry, and industry was heavily engaged in that program as well. So Department of Energy actually had accident-tolerant fuel campaigns and programs long before Fukushima. However, there was a huge spin-up in funding for those programs and development of novel technologies, basically in response, right? And then there was also a lot of funding that then went to the fuel vendors themselves, because anytime that you're going to change out the fuel, we can have the oil and gas analogy. If we all decide we need to fundamentally have different gasoline in our car, someone has to process that, right? Exxon or others, right, are gonna process that and fundamentally change that process so that we now have a new product in our car. It's the same for a nuclear reactor. If we've been running with uranium dioxide and zirconium-based claddings for decades. Prior to that, we had some stainless steel-based claddings, and this is globally. So the same 3 vendors that supply the U.S. with all of their fuel for their reactors pretty much supply the whole world with their fuel for their reactors. So imagine going to the cereal aisle and there's only 3 types of cereal, right? Those are kind of the options for nuclear fuel until the federal government actually did start incentivizing these fuel vendors to start looking at novel technologies. And how that kind of that engagement between them, the federal government, the fuel vendors themselves, so these are Westinghouse, Framatome, which used to be Areva, and then GE's subsidiary that focuses on fuel development. They wanted to focus on different aspects of this. So the cladding in response to Fukushima was the most, I'll say, low-hanging fruit. And 90% of the funds that the federal government did pump into this, and other governments across the world, went into fixing the cladding, so the metallic structure that holds the fuel in place in the reactor and is exposed to the coolant. So that's why, so it's high temperature steam reactions is basically why that accident went the way that it did. Where we focused our research is actually in the fuel pellets itself, so the compound, the chemical compound that bears uranium. Those are really expensive investigations, and from an economic standpoint, if we're going to change how we make uranium compounds, you would have to do that at each one of these fuel vendors. And so it's hard to imagine 3 separate companies saying, we have these fuel process or these fuel fabrication plants. We're going to completely deconstruct them and rebuild them for a new chemical process. So that's what kind of changed or shifted the conversations around this, and as well as the funding around this, from short-term accident-tolerant fuels. So these are things that you could deploy within less than 10 years. So very small changes that, we're still in line with how we process uranium dioxide. So we call them doped UO2. And UO2 was already doped before the accident-tolerant fuels program, but we dope them differently now. And by we, I mean, industry. And then looking at coated cladding structures so that you could keep your same fabrication, you could keep your same industrial process, but we're adding things to it to make it safer rather than fundamentally changing how we make fuels. And that said, during that accident-tolerant fuels campaign, we were able to do basic R&D on different fuel types and different cladding types. And now when we look at advanced reactors, we get to leverage the knowledge that we gained during that period on more of these longer-term accident-tolerant fuels to see how much more applicable they are to different reactor types. Kevin, I hope that answered the question. But there's a lot that tied up in 20 years of research.
Folding into that over decades.
Yeah.
I guess from the policy, so Eric, you were engaged in the Texas Public Utility Commission Advanced Nuclear Working Group, helping to guide some of the conversation around economics there. How would policy related to potential consequence in an accident, how does that get folded into the costs and the economics of the reactor? Or is that, hidden from the actual company that is trying to do the investment? Where does that come into play from an economics or policy standpoint?
Like the risk of another accident?
Yeah.
Well, that's built into like the discounted cash flow. There's a section that each year that the company is operating the reactor, a portion of the revenue that they're generating is going towards, it's supposed to be a fund that you could use to decommission the plant at the end. That way somebody isn't stuck with it, it doesn't become an abandoned asset that the local community has to take care of. There's a fund that will help take that down, or in the event of an accident, that money could go towards decommissioning, decontamination, and then there are also federal funds as well that are supposed to guarantee, I don't recall, but it's billions of dollars towards cleaning up and rectifying an accident. The fuels themselves, I assume, these newer fuels will likely cost more than the traditional fuels. So that will have to be worked into the equations to balance that out. I mean, the state or whatever state or the federal government could implement some policy that maybe it gives a tax credit of some sort to companies that use these newer and safer advanced fuels to incentivize them to go forward with those. So I think that's what I've been looking at.
Okay. So coming back to the ExxonMobil, you guys in some ways, you operate facilities worldwide. And so, there's a lot of conversation around nuclear here in Texas and what can we do to add nuclear to the grid in Texas, but you can't rely on just a Texas solution because you're building plants in China and India and all across the world. What kinds of things could Texas do to drive Exxon to jumpstart their investment or reliance on nuclear in Texas? Or are things already in process that are happening?
Yeah, I've been keeping an eye on what's the bills that have been introduced and kind of working through the legislator. I was familiar with the Texas working group that you mentioned. We actually were participants on that, and so I think one of the challenges with nuclear is the chicken and the egg problem, right? Of how do you get over that hump for that first of a kind deployment? We know that it's new technology. It's going to be a little bit more expensive for the first deployments. It looks promising if you can get to those commercial at scale deployments, but how do you get there, right? And I think that's where some sort of government funding, subsidies, incentives, it has a really important role in helping achieve that. I think that's what wind and solar got a lot of support and helped make those deployments successful. So I think a early kind of demonstration type deployment, a pilot plant to really show that the technology is feasible and kind of help work through some of the challenges could be helpful. The Dow X-Energy project was mentioned earlier, so they've got a pretty big support from a federal subsidy through the ARDP Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, right? And so that looks to be really successful in kind of getting the ball going there. So I would encourage Texas, the state, to the legislator to look at how could we bridge the gap on cost to get these first of a kind deployed. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. There are other challenges with siting and environmental reviews and the regulatory, all of those need to be looked at, but the number one hurdle, I think, is cost. If you can kind of bridge that gap to get the first ones deployed, then that can help. I also think it's important that we're thinking about the heat integration aspect of it. I know there's a lot of activity, at Texas A&M with the Rellis campus. They're looking at deploying 4 different technologies. I'm not sure about all of the details on that, but one question I kind of have is there a heat integration aspect of that, right? I don't want to forget about the industrial integration opportunity there, because I think the power is important. We should absolutely be doing that. But if we aren't thinking about integrating into industrial facilities, then I think we're gonna kind of skip past that part, and then it may be kind of hard to go back and kind of say, well, actually, the way that plant was designed, we had to redesign it. Well, that's going to require another application, right? And so just thinking about it, talking about it, and then government kind of support to help those first of a kinds would be some things that could be done.
I guess to play a little bit of a devil's advocate, how much you mentioned the first of a kind, and the answer was almost Texas should just dump money in, and that will make it all work. And obviously, money makes things drive, but just making that first of a kind plant get built in Texas doesn't mean it's going to be long-term fruitful within the state. It might just be supplementing every other part of the world or part of the country. How much and I guess both of you guys, how much does the expenses come down as you start to build 2, 3, 4, 5, plant number 6, 7, 8? And are there different things that should be done to encourage a company like Exxon to not just say, hey, build the first one for me and then I'll take that experience and leverage it elsewhere, but how do I stay here in Texas and stay engaged?
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, as you build more and more of these plants, your learning rate begins to increase. Particularly with the small modular reactors that you're building offsite in a factory, and then you're coming and assembling it on-site. With each additional one, the cost is reducing fractionally because your actual workforce who's building it gets progressively better and better. The first one, it may take them a bit longer. There might be some errors or some mess-ups, but by the time they've built the 10th one, they're experts at it. They know where everything goes, and they can move really fluidly.
I'm sorry, the acoustics in here are not great.
Ooh.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So the learning rate begins to increase, and then with each additional reactor that you're building, it's going to show, the financial institutions and investors that, this is that this can be a good investment. With just 1 or 2, they might be a little worried that it's going to stop at that 1 or 2. But as you get to the 5th, 6th, and 7th, they begin, the pattern emerges, and they begin to think, okay, well, this is something real, we can invest in this, and we're sure that we're going to get our money back, and we can continue to make money on this in the future.
So one thing I know that was discussed as part of the Texas Working Group was not just deploying reactors within Texas, but actually building the manufacturing base within Texas, right? And so, that's not, kind of really part of our core business. So that's not something that we're, spending a lot of time thinking about. But I think there could be an incentive to the state for encouraging deployments, while also encouraging, companies to locate manufacturing facilities and incentives there. So there could be a benefit associated with that. As far as the learning rates, that's a really tough one to look in the crystal ball and try to imagine, right? Because the challenge with it is that, especially with the advanced reactor space, is that other than just a handful that have been deployed, there's not a demonstrated deployment experience that you can go say, okay, well, they did it over there, look at the cost that came down. So we have to go and try to look at other learning rates across other industries or the existing light water reactor fleet in the U.S. or globally to try to kind of look into the crystal ball and say, well, if that first of a kind molten salt reactor is this amount, then the learning rate says it could maybe get down to this at a certain point. So it's hard to say, 40 to 50% kind of reduction, maybe more. What's really interesting about that is that's pretty significant in reduction, and maybe you don't hit that. Maybe you don't get all the way there, right? But if you look at other technologies that are being developed today, that are pretty well understood, they don't have that potential cost reduction opportunity. You could maybe say, well, I could maybe get that cost to come down 10%, and you're really squeezing it, right? So there's a lot of run room for cost to come down, which is encouraging, and that's part of what makes it attractive. But it's a lot of uncertainty, right? It's a lot to hang your hat on and commit to it.
Thanks. So we've got 10 or 15 more minutes. Love to open it up to the audience. What questions do y'all have?
Thank you all so much. Question for Dr. Sooby. We have been doing a lot of work in areas that are not related to nuclear fuels materials research, and what we're finding is we're overwhelmed with the interest, with the funding, with the demand for more students. How do you see that going in the nuclear fuels arena specifically? Do you see this growing, or do you think that there's some aspect of the fact that you have to build new factories, they have to all be qualified, is that going to limit the amount of research, or do you think it's going to continue growing?
Personally, I think it's going to continue growing. I think for civilian nuclear power, we might just decide that oxides and oxycarbides are the way to go. So I say that being UO2, being a qualified fuel form, and being qualified means something you can go buy off the shelf and it's already licensed. TRISO fuel is coming up that path as well, which is very close. You've got multiple companies looking at industrial scale fabrication, and that's a completely different process. The chemistry of that is totally different. What a factory or facility looks like is very different. The problem with TRISO as it's been designed and qualified by the Advanced Gas Reactor Program is the uranium density is abysmal in that. But it's proliferation resistant, it's incredibly robust. You'll see everything on LinkedIn about a meltdown resistant fuel. And we've tried to break it in our lab for about 7 years straight now, and it's pretty hard to break it. When we look at the other fuels, right? So when we look at uranium nitrides, carbides, these are things that are of interest to other applications as well. So nuclear thermal propulsion, nuclear electric propulsion. You're not going to be able to run off an oxide for very long, right? And so that's one new application that's coming down. The other thing is that we do have a couple of fuel vendors that really do stay in the R&D more than others. And so, they've invested a lot of money into uranium nitride fabrication. They're building, basically pilot scale demonstration facilities to try to start from a UF6 or UF4 route, which does get it one step closer to industrialization. So I think as long as that interest is there, as long as it's still sitting on this long-term accident-tolerant fuel, so for light water reactors, as someone that studies the reaction chemistries of these things, I don't think they should be anywhere near water. But there are other reactors that they could work really, really well in, right, that are not primary water-cooled. So we see it growing. We have more opportunities for grant funding than we can currently handle and manage. And then from a workforce development standpoint, there's a lot of multidisciplinary, I'll say there's lots of different areas of interest that students with this skill set can go into, whether it's civilian nuclear fuels or another array of probably 20 different areas within the nuclear security enterprise.
So I have a question that I'm not sure who it's for, but how do loan guarantees factor into all of these questions of costs? As a simple man, to me, loan guarantee costs the government virtually nothing, because unless you default on a loan, it doesn't cost you anything. But I also am not clear, they didn't seem to really take off that well. So I'm curious if somebody in here might have an opinion on this.
That is outside my area of expertise as well. So we've been really looking at it from just kind of running economic modeling. We haven't really gotten into the, how do you pull together the financing? We've got a whole financing team on our side that when a project comes together, they go pull that together. So I think it is an important part to be able to have the guarantees. I can't comment, though, for ExxonMobil or any of our applications.
I'm not sure how the loan guarantees actually work on the government side, but I mean, it should, in theory, help reassure any other financial institute that might be investing in one of these reactor projects. Yeah.
Is it just a lower interest rate that they would get? Better investment terms?
Yeah, I mean, an idea that I heard recently was you could provide a loan and give it guaranteed zero interest for the first 10 years, and if you happen to complete the reactor and are generating before then, you could in theory pay down the entire principal before those 10 years expire, and then you would owe zero interest after that. The only interest that maybe you would actually have would be the interest that is required to service the loan and to account for any inflation.
So from a sort of order of magnitude standpoint, what is the cost of interest on a large light water reactor? Is it, I think of my home mortgage, and over the life of your mortgage, you're paying 3 times the cost of the house. How much is that interest expense? How impactful would it be dropping it?
It's a lot. I mean, it's on a multi-billion-dollar project. It could be anywhere from, if it's a low-interest loan, maybe you could get something like 3%. Otherwise, I think a more industry standard for large, mega projects like this is closer to 8%. So it's going to be costing you tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you could eliminate that, at least up front, until you're making revenue, that would go a long way in helping a project become successful.
Excellent.
So I got a question. I guess it's mainly for the whole panel. Are you guys seeing anything? And I wanted to ask this during Bill's thing up there as well. We're obviously focused on nuclear reactors and that sort of thing, but around linear accelerators, right? So you've got the Exxon, and you're looking at materials. But so my company, we actually manufacture linear accelerators and teaming up with UT Austin on a project for DARPA this summer. But we're seeing things around material modifications. Obviously, we could look at things like in refineries to make them smaller, more efficient. So are you guys seeing that from a UT, I guess, Austin perspective, as well as some of the things that we're getting as a company that we'll get just crazy questions about these, how this technology obviously can, help society, and right now we've got a big produce treatment facility in South Texas treating Mexican produce as it comes across the border for phytosanitary applications, but also pathogens, and tons of interest. So we're about to build another one in Miami, but we're seeing that as maybe getting away from traditional nuclear materials, right? And so a lot of interest from IAEA, CDREF or CDRF Global, I went down to South America last summer to, represent the technology for, getting rid of, let's say, a nuclear material type application and use something more along the lines of linear accelerators. So are you guys seeing that as well? And obviously, I think there could be a need, obviously, in the state, because multiple universities I'm talking to around that kind of application of just something else that's technically nuclear.
Yeah, so I was academically raised in an accelerator physics lab, and the project that I did my PhD in was an accelerator-driven system. So, I think from a linear accelerator standpoint, one of the main things that we focus on is transmutation and how do we handle the waste product. As far as efficiencies of that process, the energy you're going to need off your beam, right? Those kinds of things. I mean, those are all. There's a lot of really great academic and scholarly studies out there on it. As far as something that's ready to be industrialized, I'm not as aware of it. That said, there's a lot of really great papers on accelerator-driven transmutation of nuclear waste and trying to reduce the radiotoxicity of that waste form. I think for me personally, and within the field, we see a lot more work on, are we going to be allowed to reprocess fuels? Are we going to be allowed to recover the uranium and other, potentially useful elements out of this fuel form? And typically there, we're going to look more at electrochemistry routes. However, I do think accelerators could play a really great role in transmutation of other levels of waste, right? Because the uranium is not the only thing that's active in there. In fact, it's one of the less active things that's in waste. So but I would say probably more on scholarly studies at this stage.
I know nothing about this topic.
We just lucked out here. Nuclear materials, but also knows a little bit about accelerators.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Question for the gentleman from Exxon. I've been curious for a long time. In the energy transition, all of the core skill set that Exxon can bring into the energy transition, nuclear is not one of the areas that comes to mind immediately in that. Can you discuss the core skill sets that Exxon brings to the nuclear energy discussion?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you look at our low carbon solutions business, which was started up within the last 4 to 5 years, I think, the big part of that narrative was around what is our core skill sets when we were standing up that business, right? So we're carbon capture, sequestration, hydrogen generation, biofuels, and then just recently lithium as well. And a lot of those leverage our skill sets and experience with subsea when it comes to carbon capture, sequestration, the lithium for direct lithium extraction in situ, and then the processing of it, the refining of it, if you will, does leverage a lot of the skill sets. So when it comes to a potential nuclear deployment, one thing to keep in mind to differentiate that from our low carbon solutions businesses, those are externally facing revenue generating business lines, right? We are seeking to apply those technologies internally for ourselves, but they are more than 50% as to decarbonize others as well, and that's where we're leveraging that skill set.
Which skill set specifically is that you're looking to leverage there?
Right. So when it comes to powering our facilities, though, right, we're always looking at what is the best way to provide the power and heat that we need for our facilities. And so, earlier I described a process where you define the requirements, you map everything out, and then you go through a very robust process of determining what is the best way to provide all the inputs that you need for that facility. And then you also are making a determination, are you the owner and operator of it? Are you going to rely on a third party? The whole gamut of options are looked at. And so we're seeking to understand what role could nuclear play as part of the providing that power and heat. It's early days. It's hard to say what the business model looks like. But this fits into the world of our global projects organization, right, where we're an integrator of technologies and we execute and deploy mega projects, right? So I'd say that is a skill set that we bring. I don't know if there is a nuclear solution that makes sense to deploy. I don't know what that looks like as far as the project side of the house. Again, the business model, who owns it, who operates it, who builds it, who manages it. But when we deploy billions of dollars of capital, and if there's a critical third-party component that is going to make or break the success of a project, we're going to have a vested interest in making sure that goes successful, right?
So could I summarize it for myself and carrying this discussion forward out into the universe? With all of the knowledge base that Exxon has, you have these enormous process plants with both heat and power requirements. Nuclear represents a possible option to satisfy those. You're exploring those internally. If they're successful internally, you could carry those externally and therefore arguably replace natural gas as an industrial heat source for other process plants externally.
Right now, it's more for meeting our internal needs.
Right. Okay.
Right? So we have net zero ambitions by 2050 with advancements in technology and support of government policy. So we're seeking to understand what technologies are potentially going to be part of that mix, and what role could nuclear play. There's a whole host of technologies that could help decarbonize the industrial process heat sector, some of which we are developing ourselves. But if those aren't competitive in certain environments, we want to understand that. We want to understand what other options are out there. Again, for thinking about it for ourselves, if we have a facility that we need to decarbonize, what is the best solution to achieve that objective? We're always seeking to understand what those are and be willing to deploy those technologies.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much. We're going to go ahead and take a break now and come back at 10:30 and go a little bit more depth into a few other topics. So thank you very much for coming.